Lyran Akra stood at the edge of the command center's shattered window, gazing at the ruined cityscape below. The once thriving capital of Alaris IV, with its towering crystal spires and serene gardens, now lay in a state of devastation. Smoke curled into the sky from the scattered debris of what had once been a vibrant city. Lyran's blue skin seemed almost translucent, the weight of exhaustion etching deep lines around his eyes. It had been days since he last slept, his mind running through tactical possibilities, each one more futile than the last. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning structures and something deeper, more troubling, fear. Fear that had begun creeping into the hearts of the Karani long before the Drawrans arrived. Lyran clenched his fists, his sharp fingers pressing against the cool glass. They had tried everything: diplomacy, strategic retreats, even alliances with neighboring systems. But the Drawrans were relentless. Behind him, the heavy footsteps of Commander Eli Kent echoed in the otherwise silent room. Lyran did not need to turn to recognize the soldier's approach. Eli had been a constant presence by his side throughout the war, though even he was beginning to wear down. His once immaculate uniform was now torn, the fabric frayed at the edges from days of combat and strain. He handed Lyran a small data tablet, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. "How bad?" Lyran asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The Drawrans have breached the last of our defensive lines," Eli replied, his voice hollow. "Our shields are failing. We have no more than 2 days before they reach the capital. After that, we'll be overrun." He paused, looking down at the ground before continuing. "Over 70% of our forces are gone. Our food supplies, they won't last another week." Lyran's stomach sank as he scanned the numbers on the tablet. They painted a grim picture, one he already knew, but one he could never fully prepare for. The Karani had been a peaceful race, focusing on science, art, and philosophy. They had no enemies, not until the Drawrans came. "And our evacuation ships?" Lyran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli's gaze fell. "We can save perhaps 5% of the population, if we're lucky, but the rest, we'll need to decide who goes and who stays." A cold silence hung between them, the reality of their situation settling like a weight on Lyran's chest. It was too much. Too much for a people who had never known such violence, such destruction. Lyran closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to hold on to whatever hope remained. The Karani had always prided themselves on their intellect, their ability to solve problems with reason, but nothing could solve this. "Call the council," he said, his voice a bare thread of command. "We need to discuss our next move. There is no time to waste." As he spoke, the door to the command center burst open, and a young officer rushed in, her face pale with panic. She barely took a breath before she spoke. "Administrator, Commander, sensors have picked up multiple ships entering our system." Lyran's heart skipped a beat. The Drawrans had already begun their final push. The last thing they needed was more of the enemy. He turned to Eli, his expression grim. "More reinforcements?" Eli asked, his voice tight with fear. The officer shook her head. "No, sir. These ships, they're not Drawran. They're unlike anything we've ever seen. They don't match any known Drawran ship patterns." A flicker of hope, almost imperceptible, flared in Lyran's chest. He turned to the officer, urgency in his tone. "Where are they?" The officer's hand hovered over the display panel, the screen shifting as it zoomed in on the incoming vessels. There were 12 of them, sleek and silver, painted in white and blue with strange symbols etched into their hulls. Their movements were precise, disciplined, but not threatening. Yet. Lyran and Eli moved to the main control panel, watching the ships position themselves between Alaris IV and the Drawran fleet, forming a protective barrier around the planet. "Are they transmitting?" Lyran asked, his voice tight with curiosity and disbelief. "No, Administrator," the officer replied, "but they're clearly taking up defensive positions. They're not attacking, but they're not retreating either." Before anyone could respond, the communications officer's voice rang out. "We're receiving a transmission from the largest ship." The screen flickered and changed. For a moment, Lyran thought his eyes were deceiving him. But no, it was real. A human face appeared on the display. The being was unlike any of the species Lyran had ever seen before. The human had light brown skin, dark hair cropped short, and no scales or crystal growths on his skin. His face was flat with a broad nose, his eyes a deep brown. "This is Captain Isaac Holt of the United Earth Fleet." The man's voice came through clearly, deep and authoritative. "We received your distress signal. Hold position. Help has arrived." A stunned silence filled the room as the Karani stood frozen. Lyron couldn't believe it. Humanity. What were they doing here? Why would they help them? Are you... are you real?" Lyron's voice cracked slightly, barely above a whisper. The human captain's lips twitched, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smile. "Very real, Administrator Vaughn. We've been exploring this sector for the past 6 months. We picked up fragments of your distress calls and came to investigate." Lyron took a step back, his mind racing. "But why are you helping us?" he asked, skepticism and confusion in his voice. Before the human could respond, another figure stepped into view on the screen. This one a woman, sharp-eyed with dark hair pulled back tightly. She spoke with quiet authority. "I'm Commander Lisa Naguan," she said, "and we make it our business to help those who cannot help themselves. The Drarans have left a trail of destroyed worlds behind them. We've seen enough to know they must be stopped." Lyron felt something stir within him. It was small, almost insignificant, but for the first time in months he felt the faintest spark of hope. The human captain's voice came through again. "We'd like to invite you aboard our ship to discuss strategy, if you're willing." Lyron exchanged a look with Eli. After a long moment of silence, he nodded. "We'll go," Lyron said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "We have nothing left to lose." The room fell silent as the laser plasma display flickered, casting an eerie glow across the Karani command center. Lyron stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the images of the incoming human ships. The strange vessels, sleek and unfamiliar, slowly took shape on the screen. They were not like the Droran monstrosities. No, these ships were elegant, streamlined, with subtle, strange markings across their hulls, a sharp contrast to the bloated, brutal designs of their enemies. Eli Kent leaned over Lyron's shoulder, his sharp eyes tracking the ship's movements on the display. "They're moving into defensive formation," he muttered, barely audible. "Why?" "Let's find out," Lyron replied, voice tight with suspicion. His heart beat faster, unsure whether he should feel relief or dread. If these ships were from the Drorans, they would be in position to attack. But no, they were not Droran. The humans, whoever they were, had not yet shown their intent. The communications officer's voice broke through the silence, punctuated with urgency. "Administrator Accra, we've established contact. A transmission is coming through." "Put it through," Lyron ordered, his voice cold. He wasn't sure whether he was ready to hear what the humans had to say, but the words needed to be spoken. Desperation had clouded their options, and this unknown factor might be the last chance they had. The screen flickered once more, and a human face appeared. Dark hair, strong features, and an intense gaze. The man wore a uniform of sorts, more streamlined than anything the Karani had ever seen. He spoke in a deep, steady voice. "This is Captain Isaac Holt of the United Earth Fleet. We received your distress signal. Hold your position. Help has arrived." Lyron's eyes narrowed as he studied the man. This was no illusion, no trickery. The voice was firm, calm, resolute. Yet skepticism gnawed at Lyron's insides. Why would the humans help them? They had no stake in the war. They weren't allies. They weren't friends, just strangers from a far-off planet. A moment of silence passed as Lyron absorbed the words, his mind racing. "And why would you come?" he asked, the edge of suspicion cutting through his words. "We are of no value to you. We have no wealth, no resources. We are merely a lost world." Captain Holt's lips quirked slightly, but his eyes remained unwavering. "I understand your confusion, Administrator. Earth has no interest in conquering or controlling your people. We receive fragments of your distress calls and, well, we've made it our business to assist those in need, especially when their existence is threatened." Lyron took a slow breath, studying Holt's face for any hint of deception. There was none, yet the weight of history pressed heavily on his thoughts. Was this some elaborate trap? Or had these humans truly come to aid a dying world? Eli's voice broke through the tension. And you expect us to trust you? Just like that? His tone was sharp, challenging. Why should we believe you? How do we know you're not here to destroy us like the Drorans? Holt didn't flinch. You don't. Trust, that is. But we are here to help, not to take. My crew and I will fight with you. But we need to know the details of your situation. We need your trust, but we also need to understand how you fight. Lyran glanced at Eli, both of them caught in the gravity of the decision. The Karani had always been a peaceful people, relying on their intellect and diplomacy, not war, but that had changed. The Drorans had taken everything from them, leaving nothing but ashes. Lyran swallowed hard. The choice seemed clear. They either fought for survival with whatever allies they could find, or they watched their people burn. What do you need from us? Lyran finally asked, his voice quieter now. He was still wary, but the desperation that had been eating at him for days started to shift into a reluctant hope. Maybe, just maybe, their salvation had arrived in the form of these strangers. We need to understand your defenses, Holt replied. What technology you have left, how your forces are structured. We'll share our knowledge, but only if we know what we're working with. Lyran nodded, his mind processing the gravity of what Holt was asking. The Karani had never been a militarized race. Their technology had always been more focused on advancing knowledge, on understanding the cosmos rather than preparing for war. But war had come, and now they were forced to adapt. We have our crystal technology, Lyran said, his tone quiet. It's not much, but it is ours. Our shields. He stopped, feeling the weight of the words on his tongue. Their shields had been breached so many times, unable to hold the Drorans back for long. Our crystals are the last defense we have, but they are failing. I see, Holt said. We've studied some aspects of crystal technology. Maybe we can help stabilize your shields long enough to buy us some time? He hesitated, his gaze steady. But we'll need your cooperation, and that means trusting us, not as conquerors, not as enemies, but as allies. Lyran's heart pounded in his chest. Trust. It was the one thing the Karani had lost in the years of war. And yet the humans stood before him, offering the one thing they hadn't given up. Hope. It was a fragile thing, barely a whisper, but it was all they had left. Very well, Lyran said after a long pause, his voice firm. We'll help you. But know this, if you betray us, the consequences will be dire. The Drorans will not be the only threat we face. Holt gave a slight nod, his face unreadable. Understood, Administrator. Let's work together and finish this war. The conversation continued, a delicate balance of skepticism and strategy. The Karani military leaders, still unsure, listened as the humans outlined their plans. Weapons, shields, tactics. The humans had the technology, but it was the strategy and their willingness to work with the Karani that set them apart from their enemies. It was a step into the unknown, but it was all they had. As the meeting drew to a close, Lyran felt the weight of the decision press on him. Trusting the humans was a gamble, one that could either save his people or doom them to further destruction. But one thing was clear, the Karani had no more time for hesitation. If they were to survive, they would need to fight, and they would need to do so together. The laser plasma display flickered, showing the humans' fleet in full formation. They had come to aid, to fight alongside the Karani. And as the last of the desperate battles raged on the planet's surface, Lyran knew that this fragile alliance was their final, best hope. Lyran stood at the edge of the command center, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the human's shield technology projected on the laser plasma display. A buzzing tension filled the room. The Karani, traditionally a peaceful people, had never worked with anyone so focused on war. It was hard to ignore the gnawing distrust that lingered within him. Yet standing on the precipice of annihilation, he knew there was no choice but to try and make this alliance work. Captain Holt stood beside him, discussing the finer points of human weaponry with Eli, while Commander Nuon briefed the Karani officers on the shield system. Holt's deep voice carried a hint of authority that Lyran couldn't deny. Despite the wariness building in him, Lyran couldn't ignore the fact that the humans had brought solutions with them. Tangible, effective solutions. Here, Holt gestured toward a model of the adaptive shields, which pulsed softly on the display. These shields work by absorbing incoming energy and adapting to it, learning from each attack. The more the Drorans hit us, the stronger our defenses become. His finger moved, touching the screen to demonstrate the shield's capabilities. What you're seeing here is something we've perfected over the years, not brute force, but the ability to bend, to adapt. Lyran's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications of the technology. You're telling me that your ships can take repeated hits without buckling? How do we integrate this into our own systems? Holt nodded, his tone even, reassuring. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we've been working with other species to combine their technologies with ours. The key is in the energy flow, specifically how we generate and transfer energy across the shields. Your crystal tech could be a game changer if we can synchronize it. Eli stepped forward, his face tense, but his voice calm. So, you're saying we need to mesh our tech with yours? What's in it for you? Survival, Holt said simply, meeting Eli's gaze without flinching. We've all been through hell. The Drorans don't discriminate. They'll destroy anything in their path. Helping you means we have a better shot at stopping them, and that's something Earth is willing to fight for. The silence stretched as the weight of the situation settled on everyone. Lyran was still unconvinced, but the reality was impossible to ignore. Their defenses were failing, and if the humans could deliver on their promises, they might stand a chance. He couldn't afford to let fear dictate his choices, not now. Not when so many lives hung in the balance. We'll work together, Lyran said, his voice carrying authority that wasn't entirely his own. But this collaboration starts with trust, and that trust needs to be earned, Captain. Let's see if we can make this work. Holt gave a curt nod. Understood, Administrator. I'll make sure we earn it. The next few hours were filled with tense but necessary cooperation. Lyran watched as the humans demonstrated their kinetic weaponry, showing the Karani officers how the technology worked. The weapons weren't as complex as the Drorans' vast arsenal, but their effectiveness was undeniable. Each shot fired from the human guns sent shockwaves through the air, the force of the impact causing small tremors across the room. The simplicity of the design was in stark contrast to the bulk and unnecessary complexity of the Droran arsenal. Think of it like this, Lieutenant Maria Delgado said, explaining the weapon's function to a group of Karani soldiers. The kinetic projectiles may not have the raw power of energy blasts, but they have speed and impact. They're faster, they're smaller, and they can punch through even the strongest armor. Lyran observed the humans and Karani soldiers working together, each side learning the other's methods. The Karani were a meticulous people, quick to learn, but the humans' unorthodox approach to warfare still felt alien to them. Yet despite the tension, something was happening. The training was taking hold, the Karani adapting to the new tech with surprising speed. By the end of the day, the first signs of cooperation were visible. The Karani had managed to integrate the humans' adaptive shields into their crystal-based technology, though it was still rudimentary. Lyran stood before the display as the first prototype of a hybrid shield hummed into existence. It's working, Lyran muttered under his breath, eyes wide with disbelief. It's really working. Eli walked up beside him, a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe we're not completely hopeless after all. But there's still so much to do, Lyran replied, his mind already running through the next steps. The shield was just one piece of the puzzle. The battle was still to come, and every detail needed to be planned with precision. The next few days saw the humans and Karani working in tandem, their strategies meshing more and more. It was a rough start, with the Karani soldiers struggling to master human tactics. But slowly, trust began to build. There were moments of frustration, of miscommunication, but there were also small victories. A Karani officer managed to successfully use a human grenade launcher with precision. A human Marine, in turn, began to understand how the Karani could wield their crystal tech in ways the humans hadn't anticipated. By the end of the second day, the human fleet had positioned itself defensively around Alaris IV. The ships, sleek and agile, took up strategic positions to shield the planet. Though their presence was a beacon of hope, the reality of their situation wasn't lost on anyone. There was still a massive Droran fleet just beyond the horizon, and the clock was ticking. Lyron found himself standing next to Captain Holt on the observation deck, watching as the human ships adjusted their formations. "You're playing with fire, Holt," Lyron said, his voice sharp. "You're outnumbered." "We're playing for survival," Holt responded, his voice calm. "And sometimes, when the odds are against you, that's when you find out who you really are." The words lingered in the air between them. Lyron wasn't sure if he believed them yet, but as he watched the human fleet move into position, he realized one thing. They were not alone anymore. "Let's make sure we don't find out the hard way," Lyron said, turning away from the view. Lyron's hands were trembling slightly as he examined the tactical maps projected on the heads-up display. The Drarans had made their move. The first wave was nearly upon them, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The Kyrani had never faced an invasion like this. Fast, relentless, and overwhelming. Their world, once a beacon of peace, was now under siege, and the clock was ticking. The display flickered with a fresh wave of data. The Draran fleet, massive and brutal, was approaching rapidly. Yet Lyron knew the key to survival lay not in firepower, but in strategy. And in that, he had found an unlikely ally in the human forces. "Captain Holt," Lyron said, his voice steady despite the pressure mounting on his chest. "How much longer before they reach the planetary defenses?" Holt stood beside him, his eyes scanning the rapidly evolving situation. "Not long," he replied, "but we have a shot. We've set up several defenses in key locations. We'll strike fast, hit hard, and keep them guessing. The Drarans won't expect what's coming." Lyron nodded, but a tinge of doubt crept into his mind. The humans' tactics were different. He had watched them train, observed their methods, but still, it was difficult for him to accept that this was their only hope. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, stealth, they were all so foreign to the Kyrani, who had prided themselves on their intellect, not their aggression. As if reading his thoughts, Holt spoke again. "Trust me, Administrator. We'll show you how to fight back. These tactics are what saved us during our darkest times. They'll work here too." The training grounds were buzzing with activity. Kyrani soldiers, once more accustomed to peaceful research than combat, now wore a mix of human armor and their own crystalline technologies. Lieutenant Maria Delgado, standing at the front, moved with a quiet but deadly efficiency. The Kyrani watched her closely, their eyes wide with curiosity as she demonstrated the basics of human combat. "Focus on your surroundings," Maria instructed, her voice firm but patient. "Don't wait for the enemy to make the first move. Control the ground, and you control the fight." She tossed a training grenade in the air, letting it land with a soft thud before stepping back. The Kyrani soldiers hesitated, unsure. Maria raised an eyebrow and then barked, "Move!" Suddenly, a Kyrani soldier sprang into action, scooping the grenade up with swift hands and tossing it into a nearby target zone. It exploded in a controlled burst, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The soldiers around him cheered, and even Maria couldn't help but smile. "That's it," she said, clapping her hands. "First rule of war, never let the enemy see you coming." Lyron watched the interaction, his mind racing. There was something raw about the human approach, something untamed but effective. The Kyrani had always relied on careful strategy and calculated moves, but these tactics, these were quick, chaotic, unpredictable. For the first time, Lyron felt a flicker of hope. They could do this. They had no choice. As the sun set over Alaris 4, the human fleet continued to shift into position, their ships forming a protective perimeter around the planet. The Kyrani, now equipped with human tech and weapons, were ready for the coming assault. But Lyron knew that readiness was only part of the equation. They still had to survive. Eli Kent approached him, his face drawn with exhaustion. "How are the troops holding up?" "Better," Lyron replied. "They're adapting to the weapons. Still, it feels unnatural. This isn't the way we were meant to fight." Eli gave him a sharp look. "None of us are meant to fight, but sometimes it's the only option left." Lyron's eyes narrowed as he turned to look at the horizon. The skies over Alaris IV were darkening, the first shadows of the Droran fleet making their approach. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead. The Drorans were ruthless, cunning, and relentless. But if the humans' words were to be believed, they had something the Drawrens didn't: flexibility, creativity, and the will to stand against impossible odds. "I just hope we're ready," Lyron said quietly, almost to himself. Eli clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm. "We will be." The night before the battle, Lyron found himself alone in the command center, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He'd never imagined this, never thought he would be leading a people into war. The Karani had no generals, no war heroes. They were scholars, scientists, philosophers. And now they were soldiers. Lyron stood before the massive tactical display, his eyes tracing the pathways of the Drawren fleet, plotting out their next moves. There was no room for error. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to trust his instincts, even if those instincts were now entwined with human strategies. "Administrator," a voice called out. It was Maria standing in the doorway, her armor glinting in the dim light. "The troops are ready. They're waiting for your orders." Lyron turned to face her, his gaze hardening with resolve. "We strike at first light. We hit them where they least expect it. We force them to spread out, give them no clear path to follow." Maria nodded, her face grim but determined. "I'll make sure they're ready." Lyron watched as she left, the door hissing closed behind her. A strange sense of camaraderie filled him. These humans, they weren't here for conquest. They weren't here to impose their will. They were here because they believed in something bigger, something beyond themselves. And now they were fighting side by side with the Karani. For the first time, Lyron felt that the Karani could win, not through brute strength, but through unity, through strategy. They would fight together, not as conquerors, but as allies. And as he stood there, staring out into the void, he realized one undeniable truth. They had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The first wave of Drawren ships appeared on the horizon, their massive forms blotting out the stars. The sound of battle alarms filled the command center, echoing through the tight corridors of the underground facility. Lyron stood at the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists as the laser plasma displays flickered with incoming data. "Administrator!" a voice shouted from behind. It was Eli, breathless, eyes wide. "They're coming in faster than we thought. They're already within our perimeter." Lyron's mind raced, but he held his ground. The Karani, once a peaceful species, now stood on the precipice of annihilation. He looked around, eyes settling on the faces of the human soldiers stationed nearby. Despite their own strain, they remained focused, determined. For the first time since the war began, Lyron felt a sense of unity. These were not just human forces, these were allies, and together they would fight to the end. "Get our shields up," Lyron ordered, his voice unwavering. "Prepare our countermeasures. We'll need every advantage we can get." The screens flickered again. The Drawrens, unrelenting in their assault, were deploying their ground forces. The massive reptilian soldiers, towering and ruthless, began their descent to the surface. Each wave seemed bigger than the last, and Lyron knew that holding this position would be nothing short of a miracle. On the ground, the human forces were already in motion. Maria Delgado, her rifle in hand, barked orders to her team as they scrambled to prepare their weapons. "Set up the decoys," she commanded. "We need to confuse their fire. Keep them guessing. Keep them off balance." The human soldiers were well trained, their movements precise despite the chaos surrounding them. Maria moved swiftly between them, checking equipment and offering brief but sharp instructions. The Karani forces, still learning, followed closely behind, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. "We don't have much time," Maria muttered under her breath, glancing over at Jorith. The Karani teacher turned soldier. He was crouched low, gripping a human-made blaster with shaking hands. Maria placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You'll get the hang of it," she said, offering a rare smile. "Just stay focused. You've got this." Jorith nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained. He had never imagined himself as a soldier, but now there was no other choice. As the first Drawren forces landed, the ground erupted into chaos. The earth shook with the weight of their massive machines as they advanced on the defenses. Lyron and Holt's forces had set up traps along the outer perimeter, using the terrain to their advantage. "Deploy the traps now!" Lyron shouted into his comms, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have a second to waste." Explosions rocked the field as the Drorans triggered the first set of explosive devices hidden beneath the ground. They faltered, momentarily disoriented, but quickly regained their momentum, advancing with relentless speed. Maria's voice crackled through Lyran's communication. "We've set the decoys. They're taking the bait, but we've got to keep them off our flank." "Fall back," Lyran ordered, eyes scanning the battlefield. "We regroup in the eastern sector. We need to slow them down before they reach the command center." Back on the Dauntless, Captain Holt stood in the bridge, his eyes fixed on the incoming Droran fleet. The human ships were in position, but the Drorans were overwhelming in their numbers. The space battle had already begun. "All ships maintain defensive positions," Holt ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We're not just buying time, we're going to break them." He watched as human fighter ships darted around the larger Droran vessels, their smaller, more agile craft attacking with precision. The human fighters took hits, but their adaptive shields absorbed most of the damage. Meanwhile, the human ships launched decoy missiles, drawing the Droran fire and creating chaos in their ranks. "They're scattering," Commander Nguyen reported. "The Drorans are struggling to coordinate their fleet. We're gaining some ground, but we'll need more time." On the ground, the battle raged on. The Drorans had regrouped, their soldiers marching forward with terrifying force, but the Kirani, now utilizing human strategies, fought back with a vengeance. Guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, and well-timed counterattacks caused the Drorans to hesitate for the first time. "Keep it up!" Maria shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "They're breaking. We've got them right where we want them." But the cost was high. The human and Kirani forces were taking heavy casualties. Commander Eli Kent, a key figure in the human-Kirani alliance, fell during a counterattack, his body hit by a stray blast from a Droran energy cannon. Lyran saw it happen, Eli's body crumpling to the ground, his hands still clutching his weapon even in death. A cold fury washed over Lyran. He pushed forward, rallying the Kirani and human soldiers around him. "This is not the end," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "We will win this battle." But the Drorans were relentless. The ground shook again, this time with the arrival of their heavy artillery, which began to lay waste to the Kirani defenses. Lyran gritted his teeth, determined not to let the sacrifices of his comrades be in vain. On the Dauntless, a new tactic was deployed. Captain Holt activated the quantum disruption field, a final, desperate measure. The device, a human creation, was designed to disrupt the propulsion systems of the Droran ships, rendering them useless for a short time. "Field activation in 3, 2 dots, 1 dot dot dot." Holt's voice was steady as the device powered up. "Now." A pulse of energy shot out from the Dauntless, stretching out through space like a giant wave, crashing into the Droran fleet. The first wave of Droran ships faltered, their engines stalling. Several massive vessels drifted in space, completely immobilized. "It's working!" Nguyen shouted. "The Drorans are losing their grip on the battle." But even as hope flickered, the battle was far from over. More Droran ships were coming, and the humans and Kirani had already given everything they had. Lyran's mind raced. What would be their next move? Would the quantum disruption field hold long enough for the humans and Kirani to break the Droran forces? "Now!" Lyran shouted into the comm, his voice sharp and commanding, as the battlefield around him erupted in chaos. The quantum disruption field had done its job, crippling the Droran fleet's propulsion systems. The massive ships, once a blur of destruction, now drifted helplessly in space like broken husks, their engines dead, their firepower useless. The human-Kirani alliance seized their moment. With the Drorans temporarily immobilized, human fighter jets shot forward, weaving through the space between ships, their engines roaring as they carried out decoy missions to further confuse the enemy. Lyran's heart raced as the fighters' agile maneuvering distracted the Drorans, allowing his forces to advance. "Keep pushing!" Lyran urged his troops, as the final phase of their offensive began. On the ground, the Kirani forces were retreating under heavy fire, their weapons failing to keep up with the overwhelming numbers of Droran soldiers. But their escape was far from futile. As the last of the Kirani civilians were evacuated to safety, Lyran knew it was now or never. His people could not be saved without the destruction of the Droran's forces. From behind the front lines, Maria Delgado barked orders to her team as the Kirani and human soldiers fought side by side for the last time. Flank left. Make them think they're being attacked from multiple angles. We can't give them any breathing room. Maria's words rang with authority as she moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, her squad quickly adapting to the changing tides of battle. Lyran observed, noting how far they had come since the beginning of the war. What once seemed like an impossible alliance had become a cohesive, well-coordinated force, but the cost of survival was far from cheap. In the sky above, the human and Kirani fighters moved with synchronized precision. Fighter jets, now the last line of defense, zigzagged through the space, a deadly symphony of laser blasts and energy shields. The human fleet, now locked in a brutal dogfight with the Drorans, fought with reckless abandon, refusing to let up for a second. "Eli, get back!" Lyran shouted over his comm, spotting his old friend charging into the fray. His eyes widened in panic as the young commander, ever the fearless soldier, led his unit into a deadly crossfire. A loud explosion rocked the battlefield, and Lyran's heart sank when he realized Eli was caught in the blast. "Commander Kent!" Lyran's voice was frantic, but it was too late. Eli's body had been flung back, lifeless, leaving a painful void in the hearts of his comrades. The moment of shock was brief, but it felt like an eternity. Lyran steeled himself, unable to allow his grief to cloud his judgment. The war was far from over, and the price of failure was too great. "Get back in formation," he ordered. "We cannot let this be in vain." The human Kirani forces held strong as Lyran's voice boomed across the battlefield, his command fueling them with a sense of unity and purpose. The Drorans, despite their overwhelming numbers, began to falter, unable to adapt quickly enough to the relentless assault from their enemies. As the ground forces pushed forward, Lyran took one last breath and activated the final phase of the assault. A massive surge of energy rippled from the heart of the battlefield, a signal that the human Kirani alliance was entering the final stage. In the control room, Captain Holt watched the events unfold, his face grave as he monitored the damage being inflicted on the Droran fleet. He saw the tide turning, yet the victory came with a cost. "Prepare the final blow," he ordered, his voice tinged with solemnity. "We finish this now." On the battlefield, the stakes had never been higher. Lyran stood at the front lines, the weight of leadership heavier than ever as his forces engaged in the fiercest combat of the war. The once calm fields had become a war zone, burnt remains of structures and fallen soldiers scattered across the landscape. The Drorans, although weakened, had begun their last stand, pushing back with an intensity Lyran had never seen before. "Hold your positions," Lyran shouted, his voice full of grit. "We need to finish what we started." The atmosphere was tense, charged with a heavy, palpable energy. His forces, battered and bruised, were determined to hold the line. The Kirani were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future, for their home. Maria Delgado's unit, having witnessed the loss of so many comrades, fought through their grief. They were no longer just human soldiers. They were allies to the Kirani, joined by their shared will to survive. As the Kirani and human soldiers moved together, their tactics began to harmonize. Their coordinated efforts disrupted the Droran forces, who began to lose their grip on the battlefield. "Forward!" Maria shouted as she led her squad into the heart of the Droran defenses. "We can end this right now." They moved swiftly, taking advantage of every opening, using their guerrilla tactics and new strategies to disorient and weaken the Droran advance. Lyran, despite his own internal turmoil, watched with pride as the humans and Kirani fought side by side with unshakable resolve. The Drorans, once so sure of their victory, were now feeling the weight of their arrogance. They attempted one last offensive push, sending waves of soldiers to overrun Lyran's forces. But the Kirani had learned to adapt, to survive, and to fight with everything they had. Their energy shields, now reinforced with human technology, held firm against the Droran onslaught. But the true turning point came when Captain Holt ordered the final wave of fighter jets to execute a strategic strike on the Droran command ship, leaving it defenseless and vulnerable to attack. The human fighters executed their final, decisive attack, piercing through the enemy's defenses with unwavering precision. "We've done it," Holt muttered under his breath as the Droran command ship exploded into a cloud of fiery debris. But the victory came with a bitter cost. The battlefield, though littered with enemy wreckage, was also filled with the fallen. Eli was gone, and so many others had sacrificed everything. Lyran knew that the fight was won, but the price of survival had been steep. As the dust began to settle, Lyran stood silently amid the wreckage, staring out over the field. The Drarans were retreating, their once formidable fleet in disarray. The Alliance had won, but the victory had a bittersweet flavor. Too many had given their lives for this moment. "Captain Holt," Lyran said, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Holt gave a solemn nod, his face grim. "We fought together," he replied. "That's what matters." And as the last of the Draran ships fled, the realization of their shared triumph settled over Lyran's heart. The Khorani and human forces had proven that, even in the face of impossible odds, they could overcome. But as Lyran looked over the battlefield, he knew this was just the beginning of a long road to rebuilding. And this time, they would rebuild together. The stars over Alaris IV had never seemed so quiet. The war that had consumed the planet for so long was finally over, and the chaos of the past months had subsided, leaving behind only the fragile remnants of what had once been a flourishing world. Lyran stood at the edge of the new capital's Memorial Park, watching the construction crews work tirelessly to rebuild the city. The smooth, elegant lines of the Khorani crystal architecture were being complemented by the more utilitarian designs of the human structures. It was a new beginning, but it also felt like an ending. "Administrator Lyran," a voice called from behind him. Lyran turned to see Captain Winter standing with a solemn look on his face, his uniform no longer adorned with the battle grime of war, but still carrying the weight of what they had endured. "We've done it," Lyran said, his voice almost a whisper, "but I still can't shake the feeling that something's missing." Winters stepped forward, clapping Lyran on the shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have expected. You've led your people through the darkest times. It's time to build, not just a new world, but a new future for all of us." Lyran nodded, turning his gaze back to the horizon. The sky was a deep shade of blue, clear and unmarred by the smoke and devastation that had once filled it. The sounds of rebuilding were now the only reminders of the battle that had torn the planet apart. He thought of Eli, of the countless others who had given their lives for this moment. "It still doesn't feel real," Lyran admitted, "that so many of us are gone, and yet we're here starting over. It's almost too much to comprehend." Winter stayed silent for a moment, then spoke with the kind of wisdom that only someone who had seen too much war could possess. "War changes people. It shapes them, for better or worse. But the hardest part comes after the fighting ends. It's about finding your way in a world that's no longer broken, but still carries the scars." Lyran looked at him, understanding the depth of his words. "And we'll have to heal, together." The day moved on slowly, each hour bringing its own burden of reflection. Lyran found himself alone again, this time in the great hall of the Khorani embassy, overlooking the city that was beginning to flourish once more. The Khorani people, scarred by their loss but strong in their will to rebuild, were beginning to regroup. They were no longer just survivors. They were hopeful. The next day, a memorial was held for those who had fallen. The atmosphere was somber, but the presence of so many species united under one banner added a sense of purpose to the ceremony. The memorial park was filled with soldiers, civilians, and dignitaries from every corner of the galaxy. The names of the dead were read aloud, the echoes of their sacrifices filling the air. Lyran stood in the front, his hands clasped together. Beside him, Maria Delgado stood tall, her gaze distant as she reflected on her time with the Khorani. Her thoughts were interrupted when Lyran spoke softly. "You've seen so much, Maria. More than anyone should ever have to." Maria nodded, her face hardened by the experience but filled with a quiet resilience. "I've seen what humanity can do when we have something to fight for. And I've seen the Khorani strength in the face of the impossible. Together, we've done what we couldn't do alone." Lyran glanced over at her, noticing the change in her demeanor. She had come to Alaris IV a soldier, a stranger to these people, but now she was part of their history, part of the alliance that had brought down the Drorans. "This alliance," Lyran said, his voice steady but with a tinge of doubt, It's not just about defeating an enemy, it's about preventing the next one from arising. We've all learned that war is never truly over. But perhaps this time we can build something that will last. Maria's expression softened. That's the hardest part, right? It's not the battle itself, but what comes after. Lyron sighed, his thoughts wandering to Eli's sacrifice and all the others who had given their lives. Yes, the rebuilding. It's going to take longer than any of us expected, but it's a start. As the memorial ended, the Qurani and human leaders gathered together, pledging to continue their alliance, to build a new world together. Lyron had been appointed the new ambassador for the Qurani, tasked with representing his people in the Intergalactic Council. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on him, but he had come to accept that it was his calling. In the days that followed, Lyron's role grew as a symbol of the new era. He spent long hours with the humans, discussing the future of the galaxy. The Qurani were no longer the isolated species they once were. They were now part of something greater. They had the support of their new allies, and together they would ensure that no one would ever threaten their world again. Maria Delgado stood at the edge of the city, her eyes scanning the horizon. The hustle and bustle of the rebuilding efforts were still in full swing, but the sight of it was comforting. The war was over. But her mind, despite the peace, couldn't help but linger on the loss, the faces of the fallen. Maria, Lyron called, walking up beside her, you've done more for us than I can ever repay. Your people have been our greatest allies, and for that, we will never forget. Maria turned to him, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. You've earned that trust, Lyron. Your people have shown us what true strength looks like. I just did what any soldier would do. It was a team effort, and we've all come out stronger for it. Lyron nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes. I wish Eli could have seen this day. He gave everything to get us here. Maria's gaze softened. He saw it, and so did everyone else who fought with us. Their sacrifices have paved the way for this new beginning. Lyron smiled, though his heart ached. I'll make sure their memory lives on. In everything we do, we'll carry their spirits with us. A few weeks later, Maria boarded the ship that would take her back to Earth. As she stood at the edge of the ship's landing platform, she looked down at the world she had helped save. It had been a long road, filled with unimaginable losses and hard-won victories. But she knew deep down that the journey was far from over. The galaxy had changed, and humanity's place in it had been solidified. The lessons learned, the bonds forged, and the peace achieved were just the beginning of something much greater. As the engines hummed to life, Maria looked back one last time. She was leaving Alaris 4, but it would never leave her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that it could be a future worth fighting for. Lyron stood at the edge of the gathering hall, his gaze sweeping across the vast assembly of species that now filled the space. The room buzzed with activity, voices of varying tones and cadences blending together in a symphony of galactic diversity. For the first time in history, beings from dozens of worlds, some crystalline, some insectoid, others humanoid in form, were united under one cause. The bloodshed, the battles, the countless lives lost had paved the way for this moment. A new galactic alliance, a union born from survival, now poised to shape the future. The day's events had been long, full of speeches and ceremonies, but now it was Lyron's turn to address the assembly. He could feel the weight of his position, the eyes of every representative upon him, waiting to hear the words that would solidify their shared future. The room fell silent as Lyron stepped onto the elevated stage, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. For a brief moment, he thought of the Qurani elders who had once dreamed of peace, of an isolated world untouched by war. But those dreams had shattered, and in their place, a new vision had taken root, one that could save not only the Qurani, but the galaxy itself. He cleared his throat, his voice steady and strong. Friends, allies, and those who stand with us, he began, his words ringing clear and powerful in the still air. We have fought for survival. We have fought to protect our homes, our families, and the very essence of who we are. But in the midst of our struggle, we have also discovered something far more profound, the power of unity. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. Look around you, Lyron continued, sweeping his hand toward the gathered representatives. We are a collection of different peoples, with different histories, cultures, and ways of life. Yet here we stand, together. Our enemies sought to divide us, to erase us one by one. But instead, we have come together. And it is in this unity that we find our true strength. Lyron's gaze shifted toward Captain Holt, who stood to the side, watching with quiet approval. The humans have shown us what it means to stand not just for your own, but for all who seek peace. They have shared their knowledge, their technology, and their courage with us. And in return, we have shown them the resilience of a people who have never surrendered, no matter how dark the days grew. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Lyron let the silence hang, his words sinking in. He knew that this was not just a speech, it was a turning point, the beginning of a new era, and it would only work if they all believed in it, if they all saw the potential for a future where cooperation, not conquest, defined their relationships. We may come from different worlds, different species, but we share the same sky. We share the same fate, Lyron said, his voice rising in conviction. Together, we have faced the Drorans and emerged victorious. Together, we have proven that even the darkest of times can be overcome when we stand united. And together, we will build a future where no one has to fight alone. There was a brief moment of silence before the assembly erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, a collective affirmation of what had been accomplished and what lay ahead. As Lyron stepped back, he glanced over at Captain Holt, who gave him a nod of approval. The human captain, a man who had come to Alaris IV as a stranger, was now a symbol of the new alliance, a symbol of the unity that had brought them all here. Lyron, Captain Holt said, his voice low but full of pride. You've done it. You've brought the galaxy together. Lyron smiled, though the weight of the task ahead still pressed heavily on his mind. We've done it, he replied, his voice steady. But this is only the beginning. We must ensure that this alliance endures, that the lessons we've learned through our shared struggle are never forgotten. As Lyron and Holt made their way through the hall, they were joined by representatives from the Vori, the Arn Collective, and the Shang-Chi Federation. These new allies had not been part of the original conflict, but they had witnessed the strength of the alliance and had chosen to join in. The Vori Admiral, a tall figure with a breathing apparatus, stepped forward and placed a hand on Lyron's shoulder. Your speech, he said in a deep voice, reminds us that unity is not just about survival, it is about building something better. We have all been touched by the Drorans' cruelty, but now together we can create something that will endure long after they are forgotten. Lyron nodded, grateful for the support. The Admiral was right. This was not just about defeating a common enemy. It was about creating a galaxy where peace could flourish, where cooperation would be the cornerstone of every interaction, and where the scars of war could be healed by the strength of diversity. The representatives gathered around Lyron, each offering their own words of support, their own pledges to the new alliance. One by one, they came forward, reaffirming their commitment to a future where cooperation, not conquest, would define their relationships. The Khorani, once isolated and vulnerable, were now part of a greater whole, a galaxy-wide community that would no longer tolerate the kind of tyranny they had faced for so long. As the speeches came to a close, Lyron stepped back to survey the room. The vast diversity of species, cultures, and histories before him no longer seemed so vast. They were all united now, working together toward a common goal. The challenges would not end with the formation of the alliance, but they had taken the first step, a step toward a future where diversity was not a source of division, but a source of strength. We are not the same, Lyron said, his voice carrying across the room once more. But it is in our differences that we find our greatest strength. Together, we are more than the sum of our parts. We are a new galaxy, a galaxy united not by force, but by choice. As the final words echoed through the hall, Lyron allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had come a long way from the days when Alaris IV had seemed on the brink of destruction. Now, standing at the center of a united galaxy, he saw a future full of hope, a future built on cooperation, unity, and the strength found in diversity. The sky over Alaric IV was no longer a battlefield. Once marred by the scar of war, the heavens now glistened with the glow of rebirth. The air was thick with the promise of change, the planet's surface slowly being renewed. Lyron stood on the balcony of his office, watching as the first wave of terraforming efforts took shape. The once barren landscapes were now dotted with green, the crystal structures that had been reduced to rubble beginning to rise again from the dust. Alaric IV was healing, not just physically, but spiritually as well. It was a symbol of survival, a living testament to the unity forged in the fires of battle. The Qurani people had suffered, yes, but they had prevailed. Under Lyron's leadership, they had transformed from a peaceful species threatened with extinction to a force united with others across the galaxy. The human alliance had proven that their greatest strength lay in diversity. What had once seemed like an insurmountable barrier had become their greatest asset. Now with the Drorans defeated, the galaxy began to see the Qurani in a new light. Not as a fragile people clinging to a dying world, but as resilient warriors who had learned the value of cooperation and perseverance. Lyron's rise from strategist to leader had not been without its costs. There had been sacrifices, moments when victory had seemed impossible. He had watched his people, his friends, fall in battle. Captain Holt's absence was still a sharp ache in his heart, as was the loss of so many others who had given their lives for this moment. But even as the morning continued, the future became clearer. The galaxy was changing, and Alaric IV was at the forefront of that change. As Lyron prepared to address the galaxy once more, he took a deep breath. His speech, the culmination of all that had come before, was not one of triumph alone. It was a reflection of the long road traveled, of the darkness that had given way to light. The Qurani had never before known a time of peace like this, and now it was up to Lyron to ensure that the lessons learned were passed on to those who would come after them. To think that we once believed peace was beyond our reach, Lyron said softly to himself, gazing at the city below. His voice carried the weight of all that had transpired, all that had been lost, and all that had been gained. We were wrong. Peace was never something to be given. It is something to be fought for, something to be earned, and something to be shared. He turned away from the window and walked toward the holo display. The faces of his people, his allies, and the leaders of the galaxy appeared before him. The Qurani had sent their representatives, and the humans had done the same. The other species that had joined the alliance were now part of this shared future. As he prepared to speak, the reality of what he was about to say settled over him. This was more than just a speech. This was a call to action, a reminder of the path they had chosen and the future they had built together. Lyron stepped up to the podium, his heart steady and his resolve firm. The lights of the chamber flickered as the laser plasma displays came to life, casting a soft glow over the audience. His voice echoed through the room as he began. "Fellow citizens of the galaxy, allies and friends," he began, his words measured and strong. "When we first faced the Drorans, we did so alone, believing that survival meant fighting alone. But through our struggles, we discovered that we are never truly alone. It is in our shared experience, our willingness to stand together, that we found our strength." There was a pause, a brief moment where the weight of his words hung in the air. He could see the faces of the representatives from all across the galaxy, species that had never before worked together, now bound by their shared victory. "We have proven that even the darkest of times can give rise to something beautiful," Lyron continued, his voice unwavering. "The destruction of Alaric IV was meant to be the end of our story, but instead it became the beginning of something greater. Together we defeated an enemy that sought to divide us, and we rebuilt not just our worlds but our future." The room was still, the only sound the soft hum of the displays as the representatives took in his words. "I stand before you today, not just as a leader of the Qurani, but as a representative of all of us. Our victory is not just our own. It belongs to every species here, and to every species that will join us in the future. The Drorans sought to destroy us because they feared what we could become together. But now we are a force that cannot be broken." Lyron's words were punctuated by a soft, yet resounding cheer. His speech had stirred something deep within the hearts of his people and the allies who had fought alongside them. But, Lyron added, his tone growing somber, we cannot forget that the path to this moment was not without sacrifice. Many brave souls gave their lives so that we might stand here today. Captain Isaac Holt, Commander Eli Kent, and countless others. Without their courage, we would not be here. He bowed his head in respect for those who had fallen. The room fell silent as all present paid their respects. But we do not mourn forever, Lyron said, lifting his gaze once more. We honor them by carrying their legacy forward. It is our duty to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the peace we have built here endures. Together we will forge a future where no species is left behind, where we stand side by side, united in our diversity. The display behind him flickered, showing images of Alaric the Fourth's rebirth, the first green shoots pushing through the barren soil, the crystal towers rising once more. The Korani, standing strong as ever, now had the support of allies from every corner of the galaxy. As I look out at all of you today, I see not just the faces of those who fought beside us, but the future that we will build together. The future of a galaxy where peace is not a fleeting dream, but a lasting reality. A future where our children will not have to fight for survival, but will know the strength that comes from working together. Lyron's voice grew stronger, more resolute. The legacy of Alaric the Fourth is one of hope, and that hope will spread, just as the lessons of this war will guide us. The galaxy is no longer a fractured collection of warring worlds. It is a united front against any threat, and together, we will ensure that no force will ever again seek to tear us apart. The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that filled the chamber. Lyron stood tall, his heart swelling with pride for the people he had fought for the future they were building. As the applause died down, Lyron turned toward the horizon once more. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it seemed full of possibility. The galaxy had been changed, and in that change there was hope. Hope that, together, they could create a future where peace and prosperity were not just ideals but realities.